The ballroom shimmered under golden lights. Billionaires, board members, and investors filled the air with laughter that smelled like champagne and ambition. David Cole stood calmly at the center, a man whose very silence carried authority. Tonight was historic. His company, Cole Technologies, was about to finalize a $2.4 billion merger that would transform global education funding. Cameras flashed as he approached Victoria Hensley, the heiress of Hensley Capital, daughter of power, pride, and old money. But as he extended his hand, she paused. Her smile froze, her eyes cold and calculating. Slowly, deliberately, she withdrew her hand and turned away, murmuring, "Not tonight." The crowd gasped. David stood motionless, the sting sharp but his composure unbroken. "Respect," he said quietly, "isn't a handshake. It's how you handle silence." That single line echoed louder than the music. The moment spread like wildfire. Within hours, the video of Victoria refusing David's handshake exploded across the internet. Hashtags trended, talk shows buzzed, and think pieces flooded every platform. Some defended her, others condemned her. Yet David said nothing. In his office, Evelyn Shaw, his loyal CFO, watched the chaos unfold on multiple screens. "You could crush her with one press release," she said. David shook his head. "You don't fight ignorance with words. You let truth expose itself." Meanwhile, somewhere across the city, Victoria watched the same clip, her face tight with fury. "He's not getting my money. Not 1 cent." Her assistant tried to warn her that pulling out could trigger a financial chain reaction. She smirked, sipping her wine. Let the markets quake. By midnight, strange things began to happen. Stock tickers glitched. Emails vanished from servers. Whispers rippled through trading rooms like ghosts in the wires. Evelyn noticed the patterns first. Unexplained fund movements, frozen transactions, and a silent pullout by Hensley Capital's overseas partners. "It's too coordinated," she whispered. "Someone's triggering a meltdown." David stood by the window overlooking the sleeping city, hands in his pockets. "Let them dig their own hole," he said quietly. At the same time, in another tower across town, Victoria stood in her glass office, surrounded by luxury and fear. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from board members, lawyers, and Alan Pierce, the rival CEO who had whispered poison into her ear. "I told you," Alan said smoothly. "You play with image, not with fire." She hung up, her reflection trembling in the glass. At dawn, a journalist named Marcus Dean received an anonymous email. It contained encrypted files, banking records, and a single sentence. "She refused his hand, but her hands are dirty." Marcus opened the files and froze. They revealed a network of offshore accounts tied to Hensley Capital, billions funneled into shell companies, tax havens, and illegal lobbying schemes. The story was bigger than he'd ever imagined. He called his editor. "This isn't about a handshake," he said. "It's about corruption dressed in silk." Meanwhile, at Cole Technologies, Evelyn watched a spike on the market screens. "Sir," she said, turning to David, "something massive is happening. Hensley Capital is collapsing." David's response was calm, almost sad. "The higher they climb on arrogance," he said, "the harder gravity reminds them what they really are." The morning sun rose over chaos. News anchors shouted headlines. $2.4 billion vanished overnight, Hensley Capital in freefall. Investors panicked, phones rang without answer, and Victoria's face flashed on every screen. Reporters swarmed her estate gates demanding comment. She shouted through them, "This is sabotage! Someone hacked us!" But deep inside, she knew the truth. It wasn't sabotage. It was exposure. Her own company's false foundations were crumbling under the weight of what they'd built on greed. In his office, David sat quietly watching the news feed. Evelyn looked at him with awe. "You did nothing," she whispered. "And yet everything happened." He smiled faintly. "That's the thing about truth," he said. "It doesn't need a voice. It just needs time." By nightfall, Victoria's empire was dust. Her name trended beside words like racism, greed, collapse. Marcus Dean's exposé went viral, showing how her empire had been built on deception, insider trading, and bribes. Her investors abandoned her, one by one. Meanwhile, David walked alone on his company's terrace, the city lights reflecting on his calm face. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He simply whispered a prayer for those who still hadn't learned that humanity, not heritage, defines greatness. In the distance, thunder rolled, the storm that had started with a handshake that never happened. In the chaos of falling stocks and broken pride, Victoria vanished from the public eye. Her office was empty, her staff silent. But Evelyn noticed something strange. A series of transfers linking Hensley Capital to Pierce International, owned by Alan Pierce, David's old rival. David studied the report with quiet intensity. So he was waiting for her to fall, he murmured. Evelyn nodded. Or maybe he pushed her. Across the city, Alan met Victoria in a dim hotel suite, his smile like a blade. "You've done your part," he said, pouring wine. "Now let me handle the ashes." She glared. "You said this wouldn't touch me," Alan chuckled. "You were already burning, Victoria. I just brought the match." Her reflection in the window trembled like glass about to shatter. Marcus Dean's phone wouldn't stop ringing. News agencies wanted his exclusive. But what haunted him wasn't fame. It was a pattern he couldn't ignore. Every file, every leak, every whisper led back to Alan Pierce. He sat in a dim cafe, rain tapping the windows, tracing red lines between names and companies. Then a new message arrived. "You think she's the villain? Look deeper. Follow the money." He hesitated. The sender was anonymous again. He opened the attachment, a picture of Alan shaking hands with Victoria's late father decades ago. Below it, a cryptic note. "Old debts don't die. They multiply." Marcus knew this wasn't just about racism anymore. It was about legacy, greed, and a secret buried deep in the boardrooms of power. That night, David received an elegant black envelope with no return address. Inside was a card, "Private Investors Gathering," hosted by Alan Pierce. Evelyn frowned. "It's a trap," David smiled faintly. "Maybe, but traps reveal more than truths ever could." At the venue, the lights were low, the air thick with money and deception. Alan welcomed him like an old friend. "Glad you came, David. Business must go on." But David noticed something. The same investors who had turned on him years ago now whispered nervously. Alan's charm was cracking. When Victoria appeared at the far end of the hall, her eyes red but her pride still intact, David finally understood. This wasn't an event. It was an illusion of control, and it was collapsing from the inside. In a private corner of the event, Alan handed David a file. "Take Hensley Capital," he said smoothly. "Merge it under Cole Technologies. Clean the image. Make me your partner." David flipped through the documents. "Hidden clauses, poisoned deals, debt disguised as equity," Evelyn whispered. "It's a trap that would ruin us." David looked up at Alan. "You think money makes you immortal," he said quietly. "But it only buries you slower," Alan smirked. "Everyone has a price," David smiled faintly. "You're wrong. Some of us have principles." Then he dropped the file back onto the table. Cameras flashed in the distance. Marcus had arrived, recording everything from the shadows. The next morning, headlines exploded again. "CEO rejects billion-dollar offer from rival." But buried deeper in the feed was something even bigger. Marcus released a secret recording from the event. Alan and Victoria's whispered deal, discussing market manipulation, offshore laundering, and planned takeovers. The internet roared. Governments took notice. Evelyn stared at the news feed. "How did Marcus get that?" she asked. David smiled faintly. "Some truths find their own microphones." Meanwhile, Alan raged in his penthouse, smashing glasses. "Who recorded us?" Victoria stood in the corner, pale and trembling. "We did this to ourselves," she whispered. "We built everything on arrogance." He turned toward her, eyes wild. "Then drown with it." By evening, federal agents raided Pierce International. Reporters gathered outside as Alan's empire crumbled live on every channel. Marcus's story topped the world news. Victoria tried to flee the country, but her passport was flagged. Cameras caught her outside a private jet, eyes hollow, her world in ruins. Meanwhile, David stood on the rooftop of Cole Technologies as rain began to fall again. Evelyn approached quietly. "You could have destroyed them, but you didn't." David looked at the skyline, the city lights flickering through the storm. "Destruction doesn't teach," he said softly, "but consequences do." Below them, thunder rolled, the sound of pride collapsing and truth finally speaking. Marcus Dean couldn't stop staring at the scanned pages. He had followed small threads for days. Secret transfers, shell companies, whispers from terrified employees. And now the trail led to an old leather ledger, yellowed and careful. The ledger showed decades of payments, land purchases, quiet buyouts, and a pattern of moving poor families off their streets so developers could build towers. A name repeated in the margins, Hensley Estates. Marcus felt a chill. This was the pattern that explained everything, not only greed, but a plan to erase communities and profit from the absence. He called Evelyn in a trembling voice. "This connects to their charity trusts, to the scholarships they pretended to fund. It's hollow." Evelyn read the pages and sat down slowly. For David, the ledger was not only proof. It was a map of old wounds he had never known were so close to his work. The city had been rearranged on the backs of other people's homes. And now the truth was waking. They brought the ledger to the public eye. When reporters pressed Victoria, she laughed at first, a thin, brittle sound. But the laugh cracked when a retired clerk produced a faded photograph. Victoria's grandfather with developers, smiling over a contract while a crowd stood across the street holding their children and their carts. The image slid across the screens and made the room feel colder. In private, Victoria's mother sat in a dark room and handed a stack of old letters to a lawyer, letters that had been hidden for decades because they would shame the family name. One letter mentioned a school parcel sold cheaply in the 1970s, a parcel that, had it stayed a school, would have served neighborhoods that David later tried to help. The viewers felt the slow twist. This was not only a corporate crime. It was a family history that had quietly taken things from the very people David wanted to lift. Victoria's posture crumpled. Pride could not stand the weight of a picture and an old blunt letter. The senator on TV called for hearings. Alan Pierce did not go quietly. He launched a legal avalanche aimed at David. Leaked memos claiming insider knowledge, doctored emails that painted David's team as manipulative. Social feeds lit up with doubt. Evelyn stayed up nights with forensic accountants, tracing timestamps, checking metadata, and watching the web like a hawk. Marcus dug deeper, following IP addresses, calling sources with nicknames and burned-out lines. The pressure rose until one night a server blipped and the lights in David's office dimmed. Someone had tried a coordinated cyber attack. For a breathless hour, screens went black. Then Evelyn's team isolated the breach and found the signature. Not David, not a rival company, a ghost marker tied to Alan's inner circle. The legal smokescreen fell back into the light. The attackers had tried to poison the well, but truth has a stubborn way of leaving footprints. The public, watching the rollback, felt their anger turn from confusion into fury. The government called a hearing. Cameras filled the gallery like a second sky. Witnesses gave testimony that cut like glass. Former Hensley employees told how orders were given to hide donations, how scholarships were redirected into shell accounts, how developers moved people with polite letters and heavy police presence. Marcus presented the ledger and the letters. Evelyn provided the forensic audit that showed Alan's fingerprints on doctored files. David sat quietly, steady as a lighthouse. When Victoria stood to speak, the room watched a woman stripped of theater. She tried to call it politics, a vendetta, or misinterpreted business practice. But she had nowhere to put the ledger images out of view. Parents in the gallery listened, some nodding, others wiping tears. The hearing did not end with a single knockout blow. It ended with the nation hearing, clearly and painfully, how power had been wielded against people with no voice. The sense of right and wrong rebalanced a little. People began to demand restitution. The night after the hearing, with the city buzzing and tribunals scheduled, Victoria made a desperate play. She used the last remaining influence she had to trigger a market scare. A coordinated rumor through trusted traders that David's merger depended on a hidden criminal probe into his company. Stocks dipped. For a tense hour, shareholders faltered. David's team watched the ticker like a heart monitor. Evelyn moved fast. Legal notices dispatched, emergency disclosures filed, and Marcus published a real-time investigation showing the timing and origin of the rumors. The markets blinked, then corrected. Investors who had panicked felt the slope change under their feet. Allen, exposed and cornered, tried to bargain his safety with information, but with each lie he offered, a new wire of evidence tightened around him. Victoria's last gambit only made the public angrier. People who had once applauded her lifestyle now wanted answers, and they wanted change. When the dust settled, arrests were made. Allen faced indictments. Victoria surrendered, shaken and not defiant as before. Lawsuits began, but the most powerful moment was quiet. David stood before a group of community leaders in a battered church that had once been promised a grant from a Hensley trust and never received it. He spoke without flourish. He didn't brag about victory. He spoke about repair, funding the school that had been sold, rebuilding parks, setting up a permanent oversight board so that money meant for people actually reached them. Marcus's reports continued to name names, but the story shifted. It became about repair and policy, not only punishment. Evelyn stayed by David, exhausted but steady. The ledger's pages had sparked anger, but they also became a map for rebuilding. In the end, the handshake that started all this taught a city a hard lesson. Silence can be dignity, but silence does not stop history. People demanded better, and now for once they had proof to build it on. Just when everyone thought the case was over, a new twist surfaced. Marcus received a brown envelope left at his office door. No name, no note, only a USB drive inside. When he plugged it in, the screen lit up with hundreds of encrypted files. Evelyn helped him decode them. What they found froze the room. Secret recordings from inside Pierce International, dating back years. The voice was Allen's, talking about payments, bribes, and manipulating court officials to silence small community lawsuits. But among the audio files, one stood out, a trembling voice saying, "They took everything from us. My son, my home, my name." The metadata showed the recording was made at a shelter downtown. Marcus realized the whistleblower wasn't some insider. It was one of the victims. Someone who had lost everything when the Hensleys and Pierces built their empire. The voice gave the story a heartbeat. David listened silently, then said, "We can't just expose them. We have to restore what they stole." David knew Allen would never confess. He was too proud, too cunning. So he built a trap not made of lies, but truth. Evelyn arranged a fake mediation meeting, telling Allen's lawyers it was an opportunity to settle and save his company's remaining assets. Cameras were hidden, microphones planted. Marcus watched through a live feed, his pulse quick. When Allen arrived, calm and confident, David greeted him with a firm handshake, the same gesture Victoria had once refused. "Let's talk," David said. For hours, they sparred through words, business ethics, legacy, responsibility, until Allen slipped. His arrogance broke through, and he admitted, "Of course we bought the judges. Of course we buried their lawsuits. That's how the system works." He laughed, unaware every word was being recorded. When Evelyn signaled the team, law enforcement walked in silently. Allen's smile fell like shattered glass. The man who had thought himself untouchable finally saw the walls close in. While Allen faced criminal charges, Victoria's world grew darker. Former allies avoided her, investors cut ties, and social media turned ruthless. She stood before the mirror in her penthouse, surrounded by silence and cold light. Her reflection looked like a stranger. The woman who once believed wealth meant power now looked frightened, lost. Then came the final blow. Marcus published a report showing how Hensley Capital's charity branch had funneled public funds into luxury projects, all under Victoria's signature. She had signed without reading, trusting Allen. Now the law didn't care about trust. She was summoned to court. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs reading, "No more stolen hope." When she stepped out of the car, cameras flashed like lightning. But there was no glamour left. Only the long shadow of truth. The trial became a global story. Every network covered it. Every headline carried the words, "Corporate Greed Exposed." In court, David took the stand not as a victim, but as a witness for justice. His calm voice cut through the noise. "This isn't just about numbers," he said. "It's about people who trusted companies with their future and were erased from it." Evelyn presented evidence connecting both Hensley and Pierce empires to manipulated charity laws and hidden tax havens. Marcus testified, revealing how the anonymous whistleblower had risked their life to expose the files. Victoria sat silently through it all, pale and unblinking. When the judge finally read the verdict, Alan Pierce, guilty on all counts. Victoria Hensley, sentenced to restitution and corporate ban for life, the courtroom didn't cheer. It just exhaled, because for once, power had met consequence. Months later, after the headlines faded, David visited the same homeless shelter where the whistleblower's voice had been recorded. He asked to meet whoever had left the file. The staff led him to an older woman sitting by the window, her eyes kind but tired. She introduced herself as Mrs. Lyle. Her husband had been one of the many who lost their home in the old Hensley development. She said softly, "I didn't do it for revenge, Mr. Cole. I just wanted someone to know we existed." David knelt beside her chair. "You did more than that," he said. "You helped millions." He wrote her a check to rebuild her family's life, not as charity but as partnership. Cameras weren't there, and no press would cover it. But this was the moment that mattered most, the quiet restoration of dignity. A year passed. David launched the Legacy Foundation, a public trust that funded schools, shelters, and small businesses in the same communities that had been destroyed by corporate greed. Evelyn became the foundation's director. Marcus continued to report, but this time he wrote about hope, reform, and resilience. At the opening ceremony of a new community center, children's laughter filled the courtyard. David stood before them, not as a billionaire, but as a man who had learned that the greatest wealth is integrity. "Money," he said in his speech, "can build walls or bridges. The choice defines who we are." Across the city, even Victoria watched from afar, living quietly, far from cameras. For the first time, her expression wasn't cold or proud. It was thoughtful, as if she was finally beginning to understand. 2 years later, at a major economic summit, David Cole took the stage as one of the keynote speakers, representing a new kind of leadership built on transparency and equality. When he stepped off the stage, an elderly investor, once one of Victoria's former allies, extended a trembling hand. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I misjudged you years ago." David shook his hand without hesitation. The cameras captured it. The same symbol that had once started chaos now ended in grace. Later, Marcus narrated the closing line of his documentary. It began with a handshake refused and ended with a handshake that restored faith. As the screen faded to black, the story left a message in every viewer's heart, that respect, once denied, has the power to reshape the world when reclaimed with honor.